In a quiet, peaceful town, 32-year-old Donald Creek and his 29-year-old wife, Susan, seemed to have the perfect life. Donald, a hardworking sales associate at the local hardware store, was known for his friendly nature and dedication. Susan, a talented freelance writer, spent her days working from home and was admired for her creativity and sharp mind. To outsiders, they appeared to be the ideal couple, young, happy, and deeply in love. Yet beneath the surface, Susan was living a secret life. For nearly a year, she had been involved in an affair with 27-year-old Jake Ken, a daring and charismatic man she had met on Facebook. What began as innocent conversations quickly evolved into something much deeper. Their connection felt exciting, a stark contrast to the predictable rhythm of her life with Donald. But Susan wasn't entirely lost in the affair. While she enjoyed the thrill and attention Jake provided, she wasn't completely invested in him either. She found herself caught in the middle, unsure of what she truly wanted. Susan's feelings were conflicted. On one hand, Jake brought a sense of adventure and unpredictability that made her feel alive. On the other hand, she knew what they were doing was wrong. Although she wasn't racked with guilt, the affair didn't give her the pure happiness she had imagined. There were moments when she questioned why she was risking the life she had built with Donald, yet she couldn't bring herself to end things with Jake. Jake, for his part, was bold and confident, always pushing for more time with Susan. His carefree attitude toward their relationship kept her intrigued, but also left her uneasy. He wasn't the type to care about consequences, and his recklessness often made her wonder if he saw her as anything more than a fleeting thrill. Still, Susan continued to meet him, drawn to the excitement he brought, even as her feelings remained uncertain. At home, Donald remained blissfully unaware. He trusted Susan completely, often going out of his way to make her happy. He worked long hours to ensure their life was comfortable, planning thoughtful gestures like surprise dinners and small gifts to show his love. Susan appreciated his efforts but felt distant, as if she were living two separate lives. The strain of her secret began to surface in small ways. Susan became more distracted, often checking her phone during conversations with Donald or excusing herself to focus on work. She wasn't as present as she once had been, and while Donald noticed, he attributed it to the pressures of her freelance career. For Susan, her life felt like it was teetering on the edge. She wasn't entirely devoted to Jake, but she wasn't fully committed to Donald anymore either. She was stuck in a space between loyalty and temptation, unsure of how to move forward. On a sunny Friday afternoon, Donald was filled with excitement. It was their wedding anniversary, and he had decided to leave work early to surprise Susan. He had spent the morning thinking about how special the evening would be. His plan was simple: prepare her favorite dinner, open a bottle of wine, and reminisce about their years together. As he turned into the driveway, something caught Donald's attention. Parked just a few feet away from his usual spot was a silver Mercedes-Benz, a car he didn't recognize. He frowned, his excitement faltering. The car wasn't something anyone in their small circle of friends or family would own. Maybe Susan had a guest, he thought, or perhaps a neighbor had parked in their driveway by mistake. Shrugging it off, Donald grabbed the grocery bag filled with anniversary treats and headed toward the house. The house was quiet as he stepped inside, eerily so. Then he heard it. Laughter. A mix of voices echoed faintly through the hallway. Susan's unmistakable laugh rang out, light and carefree, accompanied by a deeper voice. Donald's heart skipped a beat. It was strange to hear another man's voice in their home. He stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Was it a friend, a work colleague, or something else entirely? Pushing aside his unease, Donald placed the grocery bag on the counter. The laughter continued, faint but undeniable, drawing him toward the stairs. His feet felt heavy as he climbed, each creak of the wooden steps echoing louder than usual. The sound of voices grew clearer, and his chest tightened with every step. The trail led him to the bedroom. Donald paused outside the door, the laughter now louder, tinged with a disturbing intimacy. It was coming from the one place he thought of as their sanctuary, the room that held their most private moments and memories. He swallowed hard, his hand hovering over the doorknob. A part of him wanted to turn back, to avoid whatever was waiting for him inside. But curiosity and dread pushed him forward. As he opened the door, there was Susan, tangled in the sheets with another man. The stranger was tall, broad-shouldered, and exuded a casual arrogance that made Donald's stomach turn. The two of them were laughing, completely unaware of his presence. Donald stood there in stunned silence, his heart pounding as the scene played out before him. The woman he had loved for years, the one he trusted most, was sharing their bed with someone else. Susan was the first to notice him. Her laughter stopped abruptly as she turned her head, her expression shifting from joy to pure panic. The stranger, however, barely reacted. He looked at Donald with a calm, almost smug expression, as if daring him to do something. Donald's mind raced. The plans he had for the evening, the dinner, the wine, the celebration, crumbled before his eyes. Instead, he was left standing in the doorway of a broken home, his world crashing down around him. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he struggled to find the words. The betrayal cut deeper than he could have imagined. Susan's silence spoke volumes. She didn't need to explain. Everything was clear. The laughter, the car, the secrecy, it all made sense now. Donald's chest heaved with heavy breaths as he took a step closer. The man finally rose from the bed, his movements slow and deliberate. His calm demeanor only added fuel to Donald's rage. Donald's heart raced, his hands clenched tightly at his sides, his mind swirled with anger, betrayal, and confusion. He had never imagined his life could unravel so suddenly, yet here he was, standing in the middle of their bedroom, facing a man who had invaded his world in the worst way. Breaking the silence, Donald's voice trembled as he demanded answers. His words tumbled out in a rush, each one heavy with accusation. He spoke to both Susan and the man she had brought into their lives, his pain and disbelief cutting through the air. The weight of the moment pressed on his chest, making it hard to breathe. How could this have happened? How had Susan, the person he had trusted and loved, allowed this betrayal to take root? Susan stood there, her face a portrait of shame. Her eyes darted between Donald and the man at her side, avoiding direct contact. She fidgeted, her hands gripping the edge of the bed, as though searching for stability in the chaos she had caused. Yet she said nothing. It was too late for words to undo what had been done. The man, however, remained unnervingly calm. His posture was relaxed, his expression unreadable, as though he held all the power in the room. The tension hung heavy in the air. It felt like a silent challenge, daring Donald to respond. Donald's anger surged, his voice rose, every word sharp with hurt and fury. He demanded the man leave, his frustration pouring out in a flood of emotion. He took a step forward, his body taut with tension, but his thoughts blurred. The carefully planned future he had envisioned with Susan now lay in pieces, replaced by an overwhelming need to reclaim his dignity and confront the betrayal head-on. The man took a deliberate step closer, his movements measured, his gaze unwavering. The room seemed to shrink as the two stood face to face, the silence thick with unspoken hostility. Donald's pulse quickened. Fear crept in at the edges of his anger, but he stood his ground, unwilling to back down. Then, with shocking speed, the man's hand struck out, the force catching Donald off guard. He stumbled backward, the impact sending him into the wall. His head swam as pain radiated through his body, the disorientation making it hard to focus. Yet, through the haze, he managed to steady himself. Humiliation burned hot alongside the physical pain. How had it come to this? How had he gone from being a man in control of his life to someone cornered and powerless? But even as doubt threatened to overwhelm him, something inside refused to give in. Donald wiped his face and pushed himself upright. His movements were unsteady, his body aching, but he lunged forward in a wild attempt to strike back. His blows were fueled by raw emotion, but they lacked precision. The man deflected each one with ease, his calm demeanor adding to Donald's frustration. With every failed attempt, Donald's sense of control slipped further away. He wasn't used to feeling this powerless, this vulnerable. The man's strength and composure stood in stark contrast to Donald's frenzied desperation. Each moment dragged on, a painful reminder of how far things had spiraled out of control. Despite the pain, despite the odds stacked against him, Donald refused to give up. He fought not just for himself, but for the life he had built, for the love he thought was unshakable. His determination burned bright, even as the storm around him threatened to extinguish it. The fight seemed endless, a chaotic blur of fists, rage, and fear. Donald's body was battered, and each punch from Jake seemed to land harder than the last. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Donald collapsed to the floor, his body limp and bruised. His chest heaved for air, blood staining his clothes and the floor beneath him. Jake stood over him, still calm, as if he had just been in a casual argument. Without a word, Jake turned on his heel and left the room, walking out of the house without a second glance. His footsteps echoed in the silence, a stark contrast to the storm that had just unfolded. Donald lay there, motionless, his mind reeling. His body screamed in pain, but it was the emotional agony that cut the deepest. Susan stood at the edge of the room, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. She said nothing, just stared at the man she had hurt, the man she had once promised to love forever. As the door slammed behind Jake, the sound reverberated in Donald's ears, signaling the end of a chapter in his life. The betrayal, the violence, the destruction, it was all too much to process in that moment. He closed his eyes, letting the darkness take over, unsure of what would come next. Susan stood frozen for a moment, staring at Donald's crumpled form on the floor. Her heart pounded in her chest as panic overwhelmed her. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, and for the first time, she fully realized the extent of what she had done. The affair, the lies, the betrayal, everything had led to this moment. Donald, the man she had once vowed to love and cherish, was lying there, barely conscious, his body bruised and broken. She rushed to his side, her hands shaking as she gently touched his shoulder. His body felt cold and limp under her touch, and she fought back tears as she tried to rouse him. Donald's breathing was shallow, and his eyes were barely open. His face was pale, smeared with blood. A wave of guilt flooded Susan, drowning her in regret. She had never imagined things would escalate this far. How had she let it come to this? In a panic, Susan grabbed her phone and dialed for help, her fingers fumbling with the numbers as her hands trembled uncontrollably. She could barely hear the operator's voice over the pounding in her ears, but somehow she managed to explain the situation. Minutes felt like hours as she waited with Donald, trying to comfort him but unsure of what to say. How could she ask for forgiveness when she knew she had caused so much pain? She had torn apart the life they had built together, and now she was left to deal with the consequences. Finally, the sound of sirens broke through the air, and paramedics rushed into the room. Their presence was a blur of activity as they moved quickly to stabilize Donald. They worked efficiently, checking his pulse, bandaging his wounds, and preparing him for transport. Susan stepped aside, her hands clasped together as she watched them work. She felt like a stranger in her own life, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The paramedics reassured her that they were doing everything they could, but Susan could barely hear them. Her mind was racing, filled with 1,000 thoughts, none of which seemed to make sense. As they loaded Donald onto a stretcher and wheeled him out of the house, Susan followed, her heart heavy with dread. The drive to the hospital was agonizingly slow, each second dragging on as Susan sat in the back seat, trying to process what had just happened. The guilt she felt gnawed at her, a constant reminder of the choices she had made. She had hurt the person she loved most, and now it might be too late to fix anything. Her thoughts drifted to Jake. Where was he? What was he doing? He had left without a care, and now Susan was left to face the fallout of everything she had done. When they finally arrived at the hospital, Susan was ushered into the waiting room. The fluorescent lights above her seemed too bright, and the sterile, impersonal environment made her feel even more isolated. She sat down, her hands still trembling as she tried to steady her breathing. The room was filled with the hum of quiet conversations, the sound of phones ringing, and the occasional burst of laughter from a family waiting for good news. But for Susan, everything felt muted, as if she were underwater. She replayed the events in her mind over and over again, each moment more painful than the last. The laughter she had heard earlier, the smile on Jake's face as he stood over Donald, everything seemed like a blur now, a twisted reality she couldn't escape. She thought about how Donald had loved her, how he had always been there for her, and how she had betrayed that trust in the worst way possible. Her chest tightened as tears threatened to spill, but she forced herself to hold them back. It was too late for tears. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. Time seemed to stretch on as she waited, the minutes turning into hours. Eventually, a doctor came to speak with her. His face was serious. Donald's injuries were severe. They had managed to stabilize him for now, but there was still a great deal of concern. Internal bleeding, fractured ribs, and the trauma to his head were all taking their toll on his body. The doctor's tone was grim as he explained that they were doing everything they could, but it was too early to tell if he would pull through. Susan's world seemed to tilt as the doctor's words echoed in her ears. It wasn't just her marriage that was at risk. Donald's life was hanging in the balance because of the choices she had made. The weight of that realization crushed her, and for the first time in a long while, Susan wasn't sure what her future would look like. For 4 long days, Donald clung to life. His body fought against the damage, but the odds were stacked against him. She watched helplessly as the man she had betrayed fought for his life, his breathing shallow, his body broken. Every time he stirred, Susan's heart would leap with hope, only to sink when she saw the pain in his eyes. On the 4th day, the doctors came with the news she had been dreading. Donald wouldn't make it through the night. The words hit Susan like a tidal wave, drowning her in sorrow. She felt the room close in around her as she looked at the man she had loved, now helpless in front of her. She had taken everything for granted, and now it was slipping away. With trembling hands, Susan held his hand, as though that could keep him tethered to this world a little longer. His grip was weak, but he squeezed her fingers gently, and for a brief moment, she felt a flicker of the love they once shared. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered one last apology. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she needed him to know. As the machines beeped softly, Donald took his final breath, and the love that had once filled the room slowly faded into silence. Susan was left alone, crushed by the weight of her choices and the unbearable pain of a goodbye she could never have imagined. After Donald's death, the police began their investigation. Witnesses came forward, some reporting seeing Jake's car parked outside the house, while others recalled hearing the sounds of the brutal fight. The evidence quickly mounted against Jake. He had left the scene in a hurry, and his actions had been reckless and violent. It wasn't long before he was arrested and charged with assault and manslaughter. As the investigation unfolded, Susan found herself trapped in the painful reality of the situation. She knew her affair with Jake had played a significant part in what happened. Her betrayal had set the events into motion, leading to the confrontation that had cost Donald his life. No matter how hard she tried to escape it, guilt followed her everywhere. She felt the weight of her decisions, decisions that had destroyed her marriage, her family, and the man who had loved her unconditionally. The funeral was a somber affair. Friends and family gathered to remember Donald, the man they all knew as kind, compassionate, and always there for others. It was clear that his death had left a hole in the hearts of many, especially Susan's. She stood by his casket, her heart breaking as she said goodbye. She couldn't undo what had been done, and the truth was, she wasn't sure she deserved forgiveness. Donald was remembered as a loving husband and a good man who had been taken from the world far too soon. Days turned into weeks, and Susan found herself in a constant state of reflection. Every moment felt heavy with regret, and every quiet evening reminded her of what she had lost. There was no escaping the consequences of her actions. The love she had once shared with Donald was gone, and now all that remained was the painful realization of how much she had destroyed.